So the 22-day tournament kicks off today in Morocco. The hosts have yet to claim a title despite reaching the final in the past two editions of the tournament, both of which they hosted. Will the third time be the charm? Joining us from Paris is sports journalist Thando Sibiya. Hello to you, Thando. Nice to see you again. Well, just want to get right away to the top of it. There have been 13 winners at the Women's Africa Cup of Nations since the tournament began in 1998. Nigeria has won 10 times. They're the defending champs. They're once again the team to beat. Tell us about what makes them so strong.
I guess it's the federation. And hi, Will. Thank you for having me over. It's really good to see you again after a very lengthy World Cup. And it's nice that we continue with the flow of football now transitioning to women's football. The timing of the tournament is impeccable. Considering the fact that it was supposed to kick off on the 17th of March and was postponed by CAF due to unforeseen circumstances, and now picking up right after the World Cup, this coincidence seems quite fitting. It draws a lot of attention in terms of viewership, broadcasting. It happens during the off seasons of men's football. So all eyes on the tournament right now. But what makes Nigeria so strong? I guess they've had it since the outset, and they continued with momentum, having the right structures, the Football Federation, their male counterparts are also quite strong. And you look at also where Nigeria, in terms of football, generally tends to feed into, and I'm speaking about men and women's football equally. And the pipeline generally goes into the United Kingdom, English football, and has now expanded into Paris, expanded into France, Barcelona, and Spain as well. And so seeing the expansion and the movement of the Nigerian women's side, the women's football side, and domestically as well, the investment, the attention that's being put in domestically, and they just seem to have a winning mindset. You look at how they're operating on social media, they seem like a confident side. Also having 10 stars on a jersey, which is something I've never seen before. It seems to add a lot of weight and a lot of gravitas. You look at how they played in the final last year, or the last edition of the Women's AFCON against hosts Morocco, coming back from a 2-goal deficit in the second half to then win in with 2 minutes to spare. It shows you that these are champions and they know how to stay in the game through and through. And that's what makes them so exceptional.
Yeah, and you mentioned how this tournament is coming off after the Men's World Cup. That tournament had an expanded format for the first time ever. This tournament has been expanded to 16 teams. What do you make of that expanded format? Is it just a money grab, or is it more entertaining for fans as well?
I guess it can be everything and something else. A money grab, money is always in the discussion. The more participation you have, the lengthier the tournament is, the longer it is in terms of presentation for broadcasting, the more you have a broadcasting deal, just the more involvement there is. So I do think that the expansion is definitely a money grab. It goes without saying. For entertainment purposes, it also goes without saying. But I do think having more inclusion. We've seen over the past few years, women's football is getting a lot more attention in the domestic leagues. The federations are putting a lot more attention because of the expansion of the men's tournament as well. So the money received, the growth and expansion of what's happening on the men's side is also drawing attention to the respective federations, the countries, the investment that is being made. And so there is a return on investment. And so when you do have a return on investment, you see continued inpour into the women's football. And so I do think that, yes, it's a money grab. Yes, for entertainment purposes, it's big. But women's football in general is growing. You see it globally. We've seen the investments that are being made in English football. You see it in French football, in Lyon as well. And you do see that there's a lot more attention, there's a lot more investment, and there's growth in it as well. There's a lot more young footballers, female footballers, who are taking this more as a profession and not just as a hobby. And so the seriousness of it then makes it a lot bigger. Federations, like I mentioned earlier, are taking a lot more seriously. And so that makes for inclusion a little bit easier, because then if they have teams to show up, so you need the teams, you need the coaching staff, you need a willing federation to then show and present themselves as willing to the African, to CAF, the federation. And it's also the leadership in the African Football Federation, which is Petrus Motsepe, who's shown a considerable amount of interest in women's football. When you look at his personal developments as well, this is the chairperson or former chairperson of Mamelodi Sundowns. And domestically, that is the strongest performing team in women's football. They've won multiple championships. And if you look at how much they pour into women's football, and you can see the return on investment. So if you see a man who's already practiced this domestically in South Africa, quite a considerable amount of women in the Banyana Banyana, which is the South African women's football side, have played or have touched on the Mamelodi Sundowns ranks. That shows you that this man understands the game, the women's game. He's poured into it. He has an experiment. And so he sees that the project is something from a business level can be beneficial, but also considering women's football, when you see what it does for women's lives, when you see what it does for these players, making them into professional players, because that's something that we've struggled with for women's football for a long time. Making women's football a professional sport and not just something that they are able to do as a job that they have on the side. So women having a job perhaps as a teacher, a groundswoman, a nurse, and then coming to perform for national duty or playing for the respective clubs on weekends, where it's kind of like a Sunday league. We are seeing the professionalization of sport. So you do see that leadership plays a very huge role in terms of representation and how seriously the game is taken. So as much as he receives a lot of criticism, I do think that we can tip our hat off to Mr. Petrus or Dr. Petrus Motsepe.
Yeah, and if the talent's there, if there's no risk of watering down the competition, then expansion at a certain point becomes a no-brainer. Thando, when you're looking at this edition, what are some of the other storylines you'll be following?
From a country perspective, there's quite a few. I mean, during the World Cup, we all saw Cape Verde and their participation. We were really stunned. And so we see the Blue Sharks participating for the first time in the African Cup of Nations, the women's edition. And so that's definitely where our eyes are going to be because of how their male counterparts performed, stunned us all, not just at the World Cup, but also in the African Cup of Nations, the men's side. And so them coming in as first timers, all eyes on them as well. We also see the return of Kenya for the first time in 10 years. And so we're seeing a little bit of a shift because there's been a lot of attention on West and North Africa in terms of the strength and gravitas in women's football, men's alike. And so it's really nice to see the shift going a little bit eastward. We've seen a lot of changes in coaching structures as well. We see there's also Tanzania, who is going to be playing the opener against South Africa tomorrow. So that's going to be interesting. Also, South Africa going further down south. Unlike their male counterparts, they've won the African Cup of Nations in this recent era. In 2022, they won and lifted the trophy for the first time. And they are quite the side to look out for. They've been finalists a considerable amount of times, making it a little bit difficult or even sometimes very difficult for their Nigerian counterparts. In that 2022 final, they defeated hosts, then hosts, current hosts. This is the third time that Morocco are hosting consecutively the Women's African Cup of Nations because they have the infrastructure. But taking it back to South Africa, they've made it difficult for the Moroccans, they've made it difficult for the Nigerians, and they've made it difficult for a lot of their opposition. So that's definitely a side to look out for. We're seeing also a little bit more maturity. So you look at the likes of Linda Mutlalo, who after the game against Tanzania, she's going to have her 100th cap. So you start to see the depth. If you, like I mentioned, the professionalization of women's football, when you start touching 100 caps, it shows you the seriousness, the willingness that these players are willing to invest their time, their energy, the federations paying them to make it interesting enough so that the players keep coming back to reach a milestone of 100 caps. You look at the coaching staff as well. Coach Desiree Ellis, who is one of the few female coaches, who is the coach for the South African women's side, who's been there for quite a considerable tenure. These are winners of the CAF Awards, winning best coach, Thembi Kgatlana, who was the captain as well, 2018 Women's CAF Player of the Year. And so these are the players who have the experience, but there's also some inexperienced players who will be making their debut appearance in the African Cup of Nations, not just on the South African side. We see also in Nigeria, there's a considerable amount. One who stands out is Deborah Abiodun, who is 22 years old, but also was part of that upset, that 3-2 upset in that final in the last edition of the African Cup of Nations for the women's side for Nigeria, which then saw them lifting the trophy for the 10th time. So there is plenty of things to look out for. But I do think that from an attention and visibility perspective, there's a lot more reach in this edition of the Women's African Cup of Nations. So we are seeing that a lot more broadcasters are taking participation. So a lot of people are also asking themselves, where can they access the African Cup of Nations? That was Dazan, who has been a huge participant and a huge driver for women's football, mainly in the global north, but they're now participating and they will be broadcasting the Women's African Cup of Nations. There's beIN Sport, Canal Plus, Channel 4 in the United Kingdom, SABC in South Africa, which is the national broadcaster. There is SNRT, Azam Media. No confirmation yet from SuperSport, but since the merger with Canal Plus, we are perhaps getting the idea that this is where it's coming from. It's not accessible to all South Africans because of that merger having a few, not red tape, but some kind of clauses that make it a little bit difficult to access, but that's paid television. But for South Africans and in the Southern African region, South African Broadcasting Channel, which is the SABC, is accessible. It is free. And there's also the CAF YouTube page, which is also free if you have internet, if you have Wi-Fi. And that is where people can actually watch the Women's African Cup of Nations. So there's plenty more visibility, unlike in previous editions. So the expansion does also see the reach. And so it's a lot more accessible. And perhaps, who knows, at the next edition, we might see a participation of 20 teams and see the Women's African Cup of Nations expand.
Yeah, wonderful opportunity. Thando, thank you so much. Thando, Sibiya sports journalist, joining us there. Thank you.